We have to make a decision as ordinary working people that we must organize for one political, economic, and social alternative.
The limits of this planet are the limits also of capitalism.
This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Oh, hi. Sorry, didn't realize we were here. I'm Toya. Welcome back to the International Socialist Alternative World to Win. I want to encourage everyone who's watching the show here today to share with your friends on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok. Get everybody into this conversation. It's a really important one that we're having. Today, we're going to be talking about workers around the world taking action. We're going to talk about the economy, and we're going to talk about the growth of the Black Lives Matter rebellion. We want engagement from everyone who's watching. So be sure to comment, ask questions. As we always do, we'll get to a point where we can answer those questions. And please like and subscribe to our channel. So let me introduce our speakers. First, we have Bart, who's the spokesperson for the Left Socialist Party and member of the International Socialist Alternative in Belgium. How's it going, Bart? And we also have Hugh, who's a member of Socialist Alternative in England, Wales, and Scotland. How's it going? Real quick, we're going to watch a video of some healthcare workers in France.
S'il vous plaît, je veux dans la
and see how capitalism actually destroys the health of working masses. The feeling they have is that, applause is nice, but it doesn't pay the bills at the end of the month. They want to see the appreciation for their role in society translated in better healthcare systems and better working conditions. This is just the start of a movement. In France, as you said, Toya, there was last week a coming together of BLM protests, health sector workers, and as always, groups of yellow vests were present. Now, the issue of police violence in France has similarities with the US, and it is an explosive situation. Last week, more than 100,000 people participated in demonstrations. And what we've also seen is the fourth consecutive weekend of actions in the Black Lives Matter movement. This movement continues to impress. This weekend's demonstrations commemorated the 155th anniversary of the end of slavery, called Juneteenth. And on that day, on the West Coast, the longshoremen, dock workers, they shut down all 29 ports for 8 hours. It followed actually a first action on June 9th, where there was a work stoppage for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to commemorate George Floyd. Now, the movement in the US is continuing and determined to win victories, as the one in Seattle, where the city council voted, thanks to the pressure from the movement and the fact the movement has a representative in City Hall with our own Shama Sawant, to ban the buying and use of rubber bullets, tear gas, and pepper spray by the Seattle Police Department. Actually, Greta Thunberg this weekend, she said, it feels like we have passed some kind of social tipping point where people are starting to realize that we cannot keep looking away. We cannot just keep sweeping these things under the carpet, these injustices. And I think it is actually a very good description of the mood in society, of the healthcare workers. People are fed up. They're not willing to tolerate inequality and discriminations any longer, but they are willing to take the streets.
Thanks so much, Bart. It's really inspiring to see how much this movement has taken up demands of workers around the world. And here in the US, healthcare workers were some of the first to do the work stoppages of 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Viewers, remember, this is how long the officer's knee was on George Floyd's neck. So this has become sort of a symbol of the movement. Many industries are taking this up, even in the conservative building trades where I work. Workers, not all workers, but many workers on Friday, Juneteenth, which we'll talk a little bit about later, took 8 minutes and 46 seconds to stop working. And the media actually isn't showing a lot of these actions. We've seen, thankfully through social media, nurses in scrubs and doctors in white jackets marching in support for Black life with signs saying things like racism is a healthcare crisis. And it's totally true. I want to move forward a little bit and talk more broadly speaking about the economy and this new Great Depression that's beginning. Figures released which showed economic impact of crisis beginning to become real in the US, in Britain, and beyond. So Bart, can you talk a little bit about the central banks in regards to this recession that we're seeing?
Actually, the question is what we can expect from the economy. The IMF is today saying that we should expect a global fall of the economy of 3% in 2020 instead of the predicted growth of 3.3%. And actually, that fall of 3% might actually even be an underestimation because it is based on the prediction and the assumption that the health crisis is going to end soon. And so in that sense, this crisis is a lot worse than the global financial crisis, which saw a drop of 0.1% in world economic output. There is this idea that the economy will rebound in a V-shaped crisis, but I think it is wishful thinking. The elites, they try to paint an optimistic picture for the future. They need to build up confidence amongst the population that they are the best ones to manage us through this crisis. What we actually should expect is difficult to say, but it is clear that there will be a longer term impact of the current health crisis. Some sectors like tourism, aviation, and others will have long-term decrease in activity. And then there's, of course, the underlying economic problems that were already present before the health crisis. In the United States, 46 million people so far have lost their job in 3 months' time. And it's an illusion to think that all those jobs are just going to come back. There's Rubini, the known economist, who talks about the 10 risks. He says they were already looming large before the COVID-19 struck. They now threaten to fuel a perfect storm that will sweep the entire global economy into a decade of despair. And actually, a decade of despair is probably the best description of what the working class can expect around the world, and they need to prepare for. For the young generation that has grown up in the past 10 years of crisis and who are witnessing, from their perspective, a bright future that is disappearing by climate chaos, by health, social, and economic crisis, they are starting to draw the conclusion that all those crises are linked, that there is something systematic in this madness that we're going through, and that it is called capitalism. And they have no other option than to fight back. And we will tell them that they need to fight for a socialist alternative.
Thanks so much, Bart. Yeah, here in the US, we're hearing a lot about bouncing back from the crisis and the economic shutdown. But with the opening up of the economy, naturally, we will see unemployment rates to drop, right? People are going back to work. But it must be said that during this crisis, unemployment was felt most heavily in Black and Brown communities and by women, 14% of women as opposed to 11% of men. And the opening up of the economy is putting Americans back to work This presents its own problems with the respread of the virus, with little protections for workers. Shortages of PPE are still in effect. For me in my industry, I'm an electrician, and normally in regular times we have N95 masks. We need them for the dust and the silica, and we can't have them now, yet we're being put back to work when it's not safe for us to do so, besides the COVID pandemic, right? And we must remember that Americans going back to work, 40% of us made more money on unemployment than we did when we were working. And it's absolutely crazy. And it just shows how low wages are right now. The stimulus unemployment of the extra $600 that people got in addition to their unemployment checks will be ending in July. And so millions of people who are still unemployed will lose this $600 benefit at the same time that many states are lifting the eviction moratorium. So they're going to be hit twice as hard. And people who are still unemployed are those that cannot work from home. You know, many service sectors, or those who have a job, those that don't have a job to return back to. There are tons of small businesses that have gone completely under because of COVID, with whether they just needed the business to come in or they weren't able to pay the rent. And interestingly enough, now that US born Americans, right? So Americans that were born in the US are going back to work. We're now seeing a rise in unemployment for immigrant workers now that US born citizens are going back to work. So it's just not a good situation for anyone. But the worst of it is going to be felt by the youth. A young member of Socialist Alternative in Pittsburgh said it perfectly last night. She said she's lived through 2 economic downturns and is entering a job force for the first time during a time of mass layoffs, right? Young people, they don't have the experience to put on resumes. And we're seeing cuts to apprenticeship programs and paid internships. And so there are millions of workers that have no jobs to go back to. Young people have no jobs to start with. And everyone's going to be put into crisis, especially come August, when we have no new stimulus bill to get people through with the ability to pay their rent, et cetera. And the last stimulus bill that we saw, the overwhelming majority, hundreds of billions of dollars, went to big business. Right? And so we can expect the same going forward. No help, real help for the working class. I want to go to Hugh. We haven't forgotten about you, Hugh. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in Britain.
Well, here in Britain, we face the deepest economic crisis of any of the countries in the OECD, which is an umbrella body for some of the richer countries. Britain is predicted to have the worst recession. And I think it's important that we understand why that's the case, but also what it will mean. Now, the main reason that that's the case is because here, big business has few restrictions on what it can do. It can do almost anything that it likes in terms of laying off workers, in terms of taking wealth out of the workplaces, taking money out of the country and stashing it away in tax havens. That was the case before coronavirus. And what we've seen during the pandemic is that pre-existing problems of British capitalism have been multiplied by all the actions of the government. The chaos around the lockdown, the ridiculous situation where the supposed track and trace app that was meant to be a world-beating piece of software now won't be available until the autumn, if ever. We've seen the nightmare situation in social care, with workers compelled through poverty and fear and exploitation to go into care workplaces and provide care while themselves sick and potentially carrying the virus. And the consequences for workers in the workplaces, on public transport, or in the community with their families and loved ones are, of course, horrendous. Now, at the time of the 2008 economic crash, which was triggered by the profiteering of the spiz in the City of London, one of the senior Tories described Britain as a small country attached to a medium-sized hedge fund. And to me, that really encapsulates it. The whole economy in Britain, the whole society in the other countries of Britain is run for the benefit, not of people, not even for the long-term good of the country as a whole, but purely and simply for the profits in the City of London. And that is even more the case here than it is in many other countries. And all the austerity and the public sector cutbacks we've seen since 2008 in the last 10 years have actually made it worse rather than better. Even at the start of this year, we were facing a severe economic downturn more big high street companies going bust. And now coronavirus has accelerated that and deepened that. What this means for working people, for ordinary people, is misery. We've got 2 million people on universal credit, unemployment benefits since the start of the pandemic. That could double or more with the scale of job losses that are being announced. 12,000 job losses at British Airways, thousands in engineering. The thousands of temporary workers taken on in the supermarkets face a deeply uncertain future as the economy is supposed to be returning to normal, but in reality is returning to disaster. Social care workers, small shop workers, all these people face insecurity and potentially face unemployment. And of course, small businesses are going bust left, right, and centre, and the government has shown that it really couldn't care less about them. And what it also means is more disasters like the ones that we've had in the news in England in the last couple of days, where food factories in West Yorkshire, in North Wales, were actually having workers who were ill or carrying COVID coming into work and potentially contaminating their workmates and potentially contaminating the food that has now gone out across Wales and across England. And this is how this system is spreading the pandemic by its hunger for profits at the expense of the lives and the livelihoods of working people. Capitalism doesn't mean competition. It doesn't mean choice. It means monopoly. It means exploitation. And every now and then, it means a devastating economic slump. This is like the 1930s all over again. And we need to fight back like we did in the 1930s. Mass struggles against unemployment, mass struggles for job creation, for wages and incomes that we can live on. And also, therefore, the struggle for socialism, because this system isn't about delivering those things at any time and is particularly incapable of delivering those things in a period of crisis like this.
Thanks so much, Hugh. I really like the way that you put that. You know, we're not going back to normal. We're going back to disaster. And it's so true. But before the pandemic, a lot of the talk about the economy was about these trade wars. Bart, can you speak a little bit about that and, you know, its part in the economic problems of capitalism?
Yes, Toya. Actually, the trade conflicts is not something really new. You know, trade conflicts have always existed under capitalism. There's been trade wars as well. Competition between different economic blocs and groups of capitalists against each other. They need control and access to markets, and in the past, it has led as well to real wars. At this moment, on a world scale, there's a fierce competition, an incredible competition. On the one hand, of course, between the United States and China, but also between all other economic blocs, with the European Union, Australia, and other players in the world trade. We are living actually through a kind of a Cold War, you could say, where there's fierce war on trade, on competition, on economy, technology, influence over the world, and militarily, of course, as well. On one hand, you see in China, there's an anti-US mood that is being created by the Chinese Communist Party. And on the other hand, in the United States, you see that there's an anti-China mood that is created mainly by the Republican Party. And it is also an expression of the fact that a growing group of US capitalists has become supportive of protectionism as an economic instrument. And the question is, what will be the consequences of this? Not just, you know, for capitalism, but also for the workers throughout the world. Actually, the capitalist magazine, The Economist, they asked themselves, you know, in their last issue, they asked themselves the question whether we are heading towards a new global disorder, with United States pulling back from international institutions. And they are afraid of the consequences that that would have for, you know, the capitalist system globally. Actually, what we can say is that we live in a world which is not based on solidarity or international cooperation, but that we live in a world which is based on fierce competition between capitalists and the ruling elites. The 99% has no interest in this defense of what they call national interests, because actually what they mean with national interests is the interests of their capitalist class, who are in brutal competition with other capitalists. Now, competition is in the DNA of this system, not solidarity, and that's why we need to change society.
Thanks so much, Bart. Before we go back to Hugh, I want to read a comment from Joe in Berlin, and I want to read this because, I mean, it's crazy how we have the exact same things happening all over the world at the same time, with a little bit of a different, feel to it being in different country. Joe says in Germany there also is a mass outbreak in slaughterhouses, meat factories. This also has a strong racist dimension because the workers are mainly from Eastern Europe. Get very low wages and are forced to live in dire conditions where, of course, they cannot comply with the distancing requirements. The exact same thing is happening in the US with Mexican workers in meat factories, actually, well, processing plants or whatever. This is what capitalism does to us. So I want to go to Hugh. Hugh, you spoke a little bit about it before, but can you talk more about what we need to do to end this sort of human misery? Is it possible? How can we fight back against this?
It's certainly possible if we fight back. And I think one of the most inspiring things about the Black Lives Matter movement is how it's become a global movement against exploitation. And what we need is a global movement against the economic exploitation that we face through low wages, through unemployment, through insufficient incomes, and through unsafe workplaces. And building that kind of movement means workers getting organised in their own workplaces and compelling the trade union movement in their countries and internationally to stand up and fight globally. There are hundreds upon hundreds of millions of workers organised in a trade union, and that is a colossally powerful force if it moves. And what Socialist Alternative and International Socialist Alternative are about is the ideas and the actions to help that movement move, because that is how we can start to change the economic conditions that we face. Now, half measures won't do. This is a real economic crisis. The employers are really determined to make working people pay for it, and we need to be as determined when it comes to fighting back. We need mass struggle, and that does mean mass street demonstrations like the ones that we've seen with Black Lives Matter, but it means more than that. We need mass strikes. We need workplace occupations. We need to enforce control by working people and their trade unions over their workplaces to ensure that these are safe, to ensure that there's adequate resources, to organise against layoffs, to organise against racism and against the race to the bottom, where different sections of workers are pitted against each other by the employers who seek to incite one worker against another based on nationality or skin colour or whatever it might be, in order to drive down wages and in order to pinch pennies from the costs of having safe workplaces with adequate resources. And so when it comes to resisting mass job losses, we don't just need lobbying campaigns. There's nothing wrong with the unions campaigning to embarrass the employers and draw the attention of society to them. But it's going to take more than that, because the employers are not fundamentally worried about being embarrassed right now. Where we face big job losses, we need to mobilise the workers facing redundancy together with their colleagues, together with the wider trade union movement, organising solidarity demonstrations, organising wider industrial action. And the thing about Black Lives Matter is it shows that a mass movement is possible under pandemic conditions. It shows what can and should have been done before the pandemic by the likes of the trade union leaders. And those people in positions of huge potential power at the summits of the labour movement need to take notice, and they need to organise, taking a leaf out of the Black Lives Matter book and taking the methods of mass struggle into the workplaces. Workers are trying to start organising right now without waiting for the leaders, and that's absolutely right. In the National Education Union, it's the main teaching trade union in Britain. 20,000 teachers have joined it in the last few months. 2,000 teachers have volunteered to become union reps. And we need to see those 2,000 and come to that 20,000 organising at the base of their union, working out a strategy, working out their demands and their ideas for the way forward, and then demanding that the leaders of their union carry it out. That's what we need to see in relation to the schools, and that's what we need to see across the trade union movement. But the crisis is real. It's not just greedy employers capitalising on a moment of weakness. And so we have to go beyond the logic of the system. That starts with demanding public ownership of the companies that are going bust or the companies that are making enormous layoffs. But it goes beyond that as well. We don't need as many air flights or luxury cars as capitalism would have us producing. But the skills those workers have are of immense benefit to society. And that's why we need public ownership of big business and of resources more widely, so that skills and investment can be used in a democratic way, planned across society to meet the needs of everybody, not deformed into a harness yoked to the profits of a few. And lastly, of course, we need to go international. That's why we have these events. That's why we're in International Socialist Alternative, because this is a global system and it demands a global response and a global socialist alternative.
Thanks, Hugh, for laying that out. It seems less daunting when you kind of break it down like that. Now, we've talked a lot about Western countries and, you know, relax in the phase of lockdown. Are we past the first wave of the pandemic? Hugh, what do you think about it?
I think in some countries, potentially we are. Although the way in which the lockdown is being lifted in Britain, in the United States, and no doubt elsewhere, raises serious dangers that there will be a second spike, and that the problems that we've seen already can return, and they can return in a worse form, actually. Because, of course, nothing has been done by these governments to prepare for the future. But on a global scale, the pandemic in some countries is still very much in its first phase and growing rapidly. In Russia, in Brazil, in Mexico, in India, the numbers of infections are still hitting record levels each day that goes past. And this is very much a global disaster. Now, under socialism, this would be a public health emergency. And by now, we would have contained it. We would have, on a global scale, poured resources into finding a vaccine. We'd have global teams of scientists from every country working together to find that vaccine. Instead, we have an international catastrophe where countries are separately, via the private sector, more often than not, supposedly pouring money into finding a vaccine, and teams of scientists split between companies, split between countries, and so on and so forth. And that mirrors the disastrous effects that this system of capitalism has had on dealing with coronavirus. Capitalism didn't create the virus, but it did create the consequences that we're seeing internationally. And in some countries, that's been compounded by ultra right-wing governments and poverty even deeper than we see elsewhere. In Russia, in Brazil, in India, we see extremely right-wing authoritarian regimes that have bungled the response even more than perhaps in theory they had to, and then used it to whip up racism. We see what we've seen with the likes of Johnson and Trump, but even more so. And I think the other side of it, though, is we see inspiring resistance. In Russia, we see the virus trade union organized by supporters of International Socialist Alternative there. In Brazil, we see the ongoing mass opposition to Bolsonaro. There's strikes, demonstrations, all kinds of protests, in which supporters of ISA are playing an important part. In India, before the pandemic, we saw the potential for a colossal workers' movement to develop against Modi, against his racist and anti-worker policies, with the potential for sweeping him out of power completely, with a gigantic general strike involving hundreds of millions of workers in India alone. But that's what workers can do. What this system will do is aggravate all the nightmare scenarios that extremely poor workers face in those countries. Poor housing, overcrowded public transport, unsafe workplaces, lack of resources, desperation, lack of adequate safety standards. You could say that about lots of countries in the world. But in the poorer countries, it's even worse. It's even more the case. And of course, all these things help the virus spread even faster. Now, many of these countries used to have health services, used to have social care services, and so on, and they've been destroyed by neoliberalism, Thatcherite policies, destroyed by capitalism in recent decades. And just as in the likes of Britain, where the running down of public services by previous and current governments aggravated the situation we face, again, that's even more the case. I think I mentioned Mexico before, and I just want to finish on that. Mexico is slightly different. There's a left government there, which is not dissimilar to what we might have here if Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party had won the last general election. And what it's attempting to do is manage the system to ameliorate the conditions that working people face and to improve them. And now we see the difficulties of that. It's a system that's based on chaos and based on reaction And this is why in Mexico and anywhere else there's a government on the left, we need emergency socialist measures, starting with public ownership and a public plan of investment to take emergency measures to deal with the virus, and then move on to solve all the other many, many social questions that working people face every day of the year.
Thank you so much for that, Hugh. We have a comment from Carmia in South Africa. They said South Africa has gone from 30,000 cases to 100,000 cases in just 3 weeks. And their economy and schools are all reopening at a rapid pace. I mean, and we're seeing this happen in the United States. In states like Florida, Arizona, and Texas, they all have set new records for COVID cases. In Florida, for example, the governor said that there will be no shutdown again. He said that's because you have to have society function. That was his reasoning. And here in the US, Florida is the largest destination for American vacations. You've got Disney World, you've got Miami, you've got all the beaches. And so it's going to be a nightmare, especially for the older population that retires there. In Texas, we've seen an 85% increase since the start of the summer, which was, the end of May, so in a month. And then in Arizona is one of, it's a place that has some of the most racist immigration laws that you can imagine. So you have a picture of the government there. 700 doctors have signed a letter to the governor simply asking that masks be mandated in public. Small request, because of the hospital's capacity is going to be exceeded, and they're saying no. This shows the fundamental problems that we have with the capitalist society, as Hugh and Bart were both laying out. I mean, doctors are asking the government that people wear masks. Doctors should be able to determine what our communities need to stay safe. They're the experts, right? Even Trump yesterday held a rally. Was it yesterday? Yeah, yesterday held a rally. His first for, the campaign for his reelection, which I'm going to speak more about later. But he called the attendees that went warriors for attending, which just shows how crazy it is to hold such an event in an arena with a capacity of 18,000 people and not require that even to wear masks, and actually made them sign something saying they will not sue if they catch the virus. As opposed to what we're seeing with the mass protests, where everybody is wearing a mask, everybody is taking it seriously. You have tables of hand sanitizer, you have tables of masks in case yours breaks or you don't have one. And so it shows that we can take action during this pandemic, but we do need to do things to keep ourselves safe. I want to go to Bart to talk about China and the new outbreak. What's going on there, Bart? Can you explain for our viewers?
Well, actually, it is not yet clear what is going on in China at this moment. But what is clear is that all eyes are on China, because the question of a new outbreak in China, of course, puts in concrete the question whether there's going to be a second outbreak, a second phase, not just in China, but everywhere in the world within this and a couple of months. And actually, the Chinese regime has tried to portray themselves as having an approach which was exemplary. And in that sense, the 200 infections that were reported last week in Beijing, are a dramatic change in the situation, as well for the regime, as well, of course, for the health crisis overall. It's a dramatic change because the weeks beforehand, the regime was in the news all the time talking about the fact that it was so effective in fighting the spread of the virus and that no infections were reported from Beijing, from the capital. And the fact that they now have to admit that there are 200 infections is actually a very dramatic turn. Officials talk about a grim situation, that the city is in wartime mode. And actually, there's a semi-lockdown happening in part of the city. At the same time, what we see is that China has also been flexing its muscles from the India border to the South Chinese Sea. And actually, it is a reflection of its insecurity that it feels because of the deep economic and social crisis and unrest in the country. China is going through probably the lowest economic growth in 40 years. There's growing unemployment and dissent amongst the population. And a new outbreak of the virus would really create problems for the Chinese elite, because they hope that they could go as quick as possible to normal. But actually, the reality is that they are still in real trouble.
Thanks so much, Bart. I have a comment from Marty in Philadelphia who was talking about the Trump administration. She says they have cut funding for research on COVID treatments and basically only funding vaccine research. We need information in treating the cases in front of us now in a vaccine. And this just again points to the inefficiency of the way this system works. We should have a system where we can democratically decide. Nurses and doctors can democratically decide where our money is going in regards to research for these health pandemics. I want to change the discussion a little bit and talk about what everybody's talking about. I know for the first time ever on my job site, people are talking about racism in America and the Black Lives Matter rebellion that we're seeing around the world. Yesterday we had I don't want to say we, right? Yesterday Trump had a rally, like I mentioned, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is very significant. So Tulsa, Oklahoma is a place where there was a massacre many years ago of Black people. There was this area of Tulsa where wealthy Black people lived, and white people came in and just basically massacred them. Actually, if you watch the new Watchmen, they talk a lot about it. It's super interesting. And so he decided he was going to hold the rally there on Juneteenth, which is another significant date. We talked previously about Juneteenth in some previous episodes, but it's Freedom Day. It was the day that all the slaves were freed in the United States. Because of pushback, he did move it off of Juneteenth and did it on Saturday as opposed to Friday. But yeah, as Yara mentioned in the comments, a bunch of Gen Zers, kids on TikTok, organized themselves to reserve a bunch of tickets. And it's actually really funny because if you look at the pictures, not a lot of people were in that 18,000 person arena because they reserved the tickets and then didn't show up. And Trump actually, I believe he canceled his next rally because of lack of turnout, which is a huge step forward in the movement and a great way to use social media to fight back against terrible racists like Trump. Back on topic, although many white Americans had no idea what Juneteenth was previous to this, many Black Americans have celebrated this day for decades. But Trump himself, he's taking credit for people now knowing what Juneteenth is. And he should not take credit. It's credit to the movement that people now know what Juneteenth is. But I want to talk a little bit about what this uprising has accomplished at actually a much faster pace than we saw previously in 2014 and 15 with the Black Lives Matter movement that happened after the death of Michael Brown. In a few short months, we've seen now cops being charged with, manslaughter or murder for killing people, which is a huge step forward. Not it's nowhere near enough because they still have to get indicted, they still have to get convicted, and they still have to be sentenced, right? We want them to go to jail for what they did. But in Atlanta, we saw a cop get a felony murder charge, which is a very big deal. Also, the NFL, which is the National Football League, is acknowledging and allowing kneeling as a sign of protest during the national anthem, which is a huge step forward. Very famous football player Colin Kaepernick was basically fired for doing this many years ago. And so now they're allowing that. The NBA had a group of 80 Black basketball players who had a meeting to discuss the terms of which they would come back to work because of systematic racism, right? We're seeing statues around the world being torn down of, old slave traders, Christopher Columbus. We're beginning to see the end to this policy that was created during the war on drugs called no-knock warrants, where the police are allowed to enter someone's home without announcing themselves. And this is how Breonna Taylor was murdered in her home, was because of a no-knock warrant. Now her city made a law that you can't use no-knock warrants. And so we're going to see that continue as well. And that is a victory, although a small victory, because those cops still haven't even been charged. We're seeing teachers unions, like Hugh was mentioning, here in the US are fighting back to get cops out of schools. There's a very, very large amount of schools in the US that have tons of cops in them, more cops than guidance counselors many times. The movement is calling for the cutting of police budgets, to be slashed. Socialist Alternative City Councilwoman Shama Sawant in Seattle is calling for a 50% reduction in the police budget. And this is very significant. I mean, in my city, which is Boston, a report just came out that the average cop who works overtime is making $120,000 a year when we're seeing teachers work 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet. So, you know, we're seeing the movement develop, but we cannot accept these small crumbs that the ruling class is giving us as you know, an end to this rebellion. They are victories, but they're small victories. You know, we can't accept big business donating millions of dollars to groups claiming to be Black Lives Matter, these NGOs, but these same businesses who are donating hundreds of millions of dollars to these NGOs are not even paying living wages to their Black and brown workers. You know, we have to resist the pandering that's coming from corporate media, whether it be painting the roads like the mayor of DC did. They painted the road to say Black Lives Matter. Whether it's Netflix highlighting movies that we should all watch to become woke, whether it's retailers selling shirts, we have to resist all this. You know, and the acknowledgement of Juneteenth is great, but we want real reforms, revolutionary reforms. And so Socialist Alternative, you know, we're calling for a reallocation of money as a step towards racial equality. And there's a real mood for that money to go towards schools. You know, over the past few years here in the US, teachers have been moving into struggle all across the country. And so we need a sustained movement of the working class, especially at this time where we're starting to see protest fatigue. You know, in the US, we're seeing protests starting to die down. And so we need an organized effort to win real gains for the movement, while also pointing towards fundamental socialist change in society as the only way that we can actually eliminate racism. I want to go to Hugh now to talk a little bit about what's going on in London. I've seen that there have been far-right demonstrations. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the racist far right has been quite clearly terrified by the Black Lives Matter movement, and sought to capitalize on some of the most reactionary media coverage, which attempted to portray a peaceful mass movement as a hooligan movement aimed at destroying war memorials, which is just simple lies. And so what we saw in London and in a couple of other places as well were so-called patriots standing on war memorials, giving Nazi salutes and attacking policemen, and in London apparently urinating on the memorial to a policeman killed in a terrorist attack. Now, these people are vicious, dangerous, racist hooligans. So why were the police so soft on them? Why haven't the media gone into overdrive against them? I think to ask the question is to answer it. There is a very noticeable double standard between the way that a peaceful mass movement that questions the conditions in British society today and in the past is treated, compared to neo-Nazi hooligans who are violently defacing things. They're allowed fundamentally to get away with it. Now, of course, most people see those creatures for what they are, and a majority of people continue to support Black Lives Matter. And that's the power of mass demonstrations, which are inherently overwhelmingly peaceful. They're much more effective. And we now have the most thoroughgoing discussion in Britain in many years, if not forever, about the racist past of British colonialism, about the way that in schools and in universities and colleges, the past is not taught accurately. It's taught according to the way that the state and the policies that support capitalism want it to be taught. And particularly appalling episodes are whitewashed. And what is not presented is the reality that slavery was a system, it was an institution, and it was a means by which British capitalism was economically constructed. And of course, the political legacy of that, in a less overt way than is the case in the US, is still with us. Is still with us now. Now, in reaction to those far-right thugs threatening to mobilise last weekend, the Black Lives Matter organisers called off the demonstration in London. And we can understand why. When you see what those hooligans are like with the police, you can imagine what those hooligans would be like with peaceful protesters. But nonetheless, calling off the demonstration isn't the answer. We have to take the threat of these hooligans seriously. We have to be organised. We have to have demonstrations that are stewarded for self-defence against racist attack, potentially against police attack as well. And we have to continue to build the movement. Calling off those protests allows the far right to feel like it's claimed a victory. The fact that it's made itself look ridiculous with its actions, they don't see it like that. They will see themselves as having forced Black Lives Matter to call protests off. And so they'll be more confident. And there's a danger that an emboldened far right, even though it's a tiny, pitifully tiny minority in society, that it can carry out more bigoted attacks against people. And this is where it comes on to the question of an organised mass movement. The urgent need for the trade union movement to mobilise, and frankly to be compelled to mobilise, its resources in defence of demonstrations. With enormous experience of organising demonstrations and marches, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of members educated in how to steward demonstrations, we need the trade union movement nationally to move and get behind this. And at a local level, an organised Black Lives Matter movement can link up with the organised trade union movement in order to both strengthen themselves and defend themselves against the attacks that they face.
Thanks, Hugh. And you know, those far right demonstrators are oftentimes the ones that are heavily criticizing social programs that go to help the working class. And as Jade from the UK said, in Boston, the police department, at least 20 officers made over $300,000 last year, not to mention all the equipment the department has. There's so many better places that money could be spent. And it's totally true. You know, we should be putting money towards social services. We should be putting money towards education and housing, etc. Bart, what are your thoughts on this global uprising that we're seeing?
I think it is a very exciting development. And actually what you could say is that the genie is out of the bottle and it's impossible to go back to the previous period. Question of racism, discrimination and police violence and brutality is a discussion point in all society. And the question, of course, what kind of strategy the movement now needs. What we see is on the one hand, that people are not ready anymore to tolerate discrimination, racism, and they also want to be able to discuss, as Hugh said, the colonial past of their countries. Here in Belgium, you know, there's a lot of discussion about that colonial past, about the brutality of the exploitation that took place in Congo, the role of the royal family in it here in Belgium, but also, and that's where we should, you know, come in. We have to explain that a big layer of the capitalist class, of the leaders of the capitalist class in Belgium, they made their first accumulation of capital on the basis of that brutal exploitation in Congo. And the racist ideology is linked, you know, to the colonial history and the slave history of capitalism. So, as I said, the genie is out of the bottle. You know, we need to push this movement forward. But what we also see, and it's something that you alluded to, is actually a lack of leadership here in the movement. There's no clear leaders who can, you know, give a perspective to the movement, put, you know, a strategy forward, demands forward, and that's why we are considering, you know, and we are planning to launch our own campaign, you know, an instrument for young people to be able to take action and to take the struggle to a higher level with concrete demands and the intention of reaching victories as they are reached also in other countries.
Thanks, Bart. So actually, I want to do a follow-up question from Yara, talking about what the answer is. Yara asked, do we think that nationalization is the answer? Isn't that just giving more power to the state that runs for the benefit of the ruling class, especially when the state is run by people like Trump or Boris Johnson? So again, do we think that nationalization is the answer, Bart?
Well, it depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about nationalizing, you know, factories that are in crisis and that are threatened to close down, I think nationalization is the crucial demand to put forward. But of course, we don't stop our argumentation there. We always link it to the question of workers' control, because what you own, you also need to be able to control. And if we leave nationalized industries in the hands of the current political leaders and the current establishment, what they are going to do with it is not in the interest of the majority of the working class. And that's why our fight to take into public ownership parts of production and complete sectors of the economy is automatically linked with the demands and the necessity of workers' control from the bottom up to determine what is produced, in which conditions things are produced, and how society should be organized.
Thanks, Bart. And that's actually a good lead into our next question, workers' control. Justin Thomas from the US said there's 40 million unemployed officially in the US right now. It's easy to say strike, but who do you strike against when there's nobody hiring? It's a clever question. Hugh, why don't you take a stab at it?
There's immediate questions here and there's bigger questions. Let's start with the immediate one. If you have a dispute with your employer, if your company is still working, you as the workforce still have the power to bring it to a halt. And whether or not that company is taking on new workers doesn't affect the fact that it's your work that makes that company turn. Now, when you have mass unemployment and lots of very desperate working people looking for work, of course the employers will try to pit the unemployed against the employed. I mentioned the 1930s before. That's what was the case in Britain then. That's what the case in the United States then. And the reaction of the best of the trade union movement, including Trotskyists and Marxists like ourselves, was to organize the unemployed together with the employed in a joint struggle for jobs for all, the benefits that you can live on, the wages that you can live on. And that, of course, goes to the heart of the fact that a system in crisis can't deliver precisely the most basic thing that working people need. But it also raises one of the points I made earlier, which is where companies are going bust and making layoffs, then this is where the workplace occupations come in. This is where the wider question, again, of public ownership comes in. But even before we come to that, it's where it's the need for a wider struggle. We see huge numbers of car workers that work in factories making cars, internationally facing being laid off. And the main fundamental reason actually is this system makes more cars than people can or want to buy. But it doesn't make too many buses, doesn't make too many trams. It doesn't have too many highly skilled engineering workers who could be, for instance, manufacturing renewable energy technology. And that's where the struggle to defend those jobs will start with a strike, will start with potentially a workplace occupation. But the idea of the wider struggle of linking up with other sectors and the idea of a socialist plan is actually not only what's needed in order to take that struggle forward, but sometimes it's what's needed to even get that struggle started so that workers can see how they can come together despite all these obstacles the system puts in front of them.
Thank you so much, Hugh, and thank you, Bart, as well, for participating with us today. Before we leave, we got to do our shout out of the week. I'm very excited for this one. It's to the Movement for a Socialist Alternative in Nigeria. And before I talk about why they are the shout out of the week, we'll show a short video of one of their members, Daga, speaking about the role of the working class and the struggle for democracy in Nigeria.
I think significant for to provide leadership for the entirety of the working class. This section of the trade union movement came into the forefront, leading Nigerians to organize general strikes, both in the oil sector as a basis of pressure against the regime. So more importantly than heaping praise on so-called Elephant Nadeko pro-democracy activists, our documentation of history should go to all of the millions of working class activists. I think significant for people like us is the entire role the working class and the trade union movements played in all of this series of struggle. Because when we mention pro-democracy activists, we ignore the fact that the trade unions were also at the forefront of this movement. Nupeng, led by Kokori, Pegasin, the major key sectors of the economy, when the Pascal Bafayu led NLC, was no longer willing to provide leadership for the entirety of the working class, this section of the trade union movement came into the forefront, leading Nigerians to organize general strikes, both in the oil sector as a basis of pressure against the regime. So more importantly than heaping praise on so-called elephant Nadeko pro-democracy activists, our documentation of history should go to all of the millions of working class activists. I think significant for people like us is the entire role the working.
Again, more sound issues, sorry for that. So the International Socialist Alternative would like to welcome the Movement for a Socialist Alternative in Nigeria as the newest section of our international. This is a very exciting moment for us, and we look forward to all the work that's going to be happening building in Nigeria. Before we end, I want to remind every member of our international to register for the virtual Marxist University. It's going to be such an amazing event. Thousands of the world's best Marxists around the world discussing almost 24 hours about the issues pressing us today. And remember, if you're not a member of the International Socialist Alternative, hurry, join us so that way you can attend this historic event as well. See you all next time, same place.